Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ancient Warfare Magazine podcast. With me tonight are Lindsay Powell, Mike Cole, Mark McCaffrey, Murray Dahm, and Mark DeSantis. And my name is Jasper Orthuis. I'm the editor of Ancient Warfare Magazine, and today we're discussing the latest issue of the magazine, issue 17.3, or in real money, the 97th issue of Ancient Warfare Magazine, Enemies of Rome, which is quite possibly the broadest topic we have ever covered, because we were just discussing before we started if there were any limits, and I said no, it's just anyone, pretty much. That includes Rome itself, of course. So we may not get around to mentioning every single enemy Rome has ever had, unless we just listing them right now for the next 40 minutes, which would probably not make the most interesting podcast. We have one question from Patreon. Brian asks, do Romans feel more threatened by organized border states than by tribal groups? The Dacia, Persia, Kushite, and Armenia are examples of organized nations who Romans tried to subjugate with mixed results. Well, that probably is enough for us to go off for the next couple hours, especially that first part, which would require us to define what a state is in the ancient world and a tribal group. But I think there might be opinions about this particular question in this group. Who wants to take it on? Mike is shaking his head very emphatically. So, Mike, Murray always has an opinion. He doesn't have to nod.
I was going to start with a joke. I wanted to say that we need to say that there's no limites rather than no limits. Hey. Roman border puns. Got to say, Roma border puns are very hard to get right. Anyway, I think my opinion would be that the tribal groups, whatever the Romans perceive that to be, because I think the reality is that they were organized states, whether it be the Celts or the Huns or whoever else, but to the Romans they were not. And they had structures that we don't see, and even that our sources describe in Romanesque terms, or even the terms of whichever civilization they're coming into contact with. So similarly, the Celts are described, with kings, so that the Greeks understand, oh, right, it's that structure, as opposed to the Romans. Oh, they have a Senate. Oh, it's that structure. But I think the reality is that the randomness of marauding bands of whether it be the Cimbri and the Teutones or whether it be the Celts in the 390s, that irregularity of their culture led to an unpredictable nature of, well, who knows where they're going to turn up? They're going to attack us. Well, they might not attack you, but they might. So I think the stabilized state that have a firm set of boundaries and a long history in an area are less threatening, which of course ignores the very, very long period of tension and wars, never-ending wars with Persia and the Parthians and the Sassanids and everyone. But I think that the randomness of those perceived tribal groups is the threat, because that's the threat that can always be brought up again. That, the Celts, the Celts haven't attacked us for centuries. Oh, but the Celts, the Cimbri of the Teutonic. Oh,
Murray, though, wouldn't in that context that they would have used a bit more geographical reference? So they would have talked about the Gauls specifically, wouldn't they? So that sort of, in a sense, breaks them off as an enemy group. I'm not sure that they are organized as a sort of nation state. And I think what's interesting is that we see it through Roman eyes, because we don't know what the Celts wrote about themselves much. That the other thing is that Caesar is unfortunately such a strong prism that it distorts everything we see. So he starts his book by saying Gaul is divided into three parts. Is it? There's 60 tribes in this. He sort of like organizes them in a certain way. And I think that's kind of shaped the dialogue ever since.
Yes, and I'm so glad you made that point, Lindsay. One of the things I want to say, skipping ahead to other enemies, just to give a point of context, is Goths or Huns, right? What are we talking about? There's so many articles, and a lot of them I've cited and gone through for the Killing Ground talk about this. When you talk about Goths, that is a generalist label stuck onto these massively culturally diverse and maybe even militarily diverse peoples. And then you also see these references to Scythians, in that later period. So I think that that's super important. And look, we get used to this when we look at Sparta, right? No one we don't have words from Spartans except for some epigraphy about their culture. We just have mostly Athenian fanboys writing about them. And the same thing here is true here. It was so interesting that you used the word random, Murray. There's this sort of image of tribal disorganization, a cultural kind of inferiority to the civilized stability of Greco-Roman culture. And I have long suspected, and I think a lot of other historians, that it ain't necessarily so, and that there is a really possibly a sophisticated culture, certainly one that could, settle Galatia, right? That could chew through, Ptolemy Koranos to do that. And that may have had a much greater level of what we in 2024 would consider sophisticated, but that was lost due to the deliberate othering by, historians who were seeing them as an enemy.
Yeah, I think it's similar to a very recent set of what they say outside the courtroom and what they say inside the courtroom are very different things. Take the Huns, for instance. The Huns have a very long history of diplomatic contact with Rome, both sides, west and east. And there are ambassadors from both sides traveling to wherever the court of Attila is, or Ruga, or whoever. And so clearly there is a respectful diplomatic contact. We are paying you 2,000 kilograms of gold a year not to attack us. We clearly fear you. We worry about what will happen. So there is a clear understanding of Hunnic culture and respect of Hunnic threat and respect of Hunnic traditions in reality. In literature, they're barbarians. They have misshapen heads. They have funny bodies. They can't walk because they're glued to their horses. So I think there is that deliberate othering in the literature, but the reality of day-to-day politics is a different thing entirely.
It also depends on who they're coming into contact with. In terms of what their idea of those terms are. If you go back to the Gauls and say, well, the Romans have got a very long relationship with Allobroges down in the province, so what they're sort of seeing in that respect might be transferred or placed upon what they refer to as Gauls, and the same with the Samnites in terms of a lot of the descriptions of Samnite equipment in terms of the Samnite army seems to be what other later writers are sort of placing upon the Samnites, because that's what they've seen in gladiatorial combat of supposed Samnite warriors.
Well, the Thracians as well. When you get the three types in the Republican era, you've got the Gauls, the Thracians, and the Samnites, and even the Spartacus revolt. It's Gauls and Thracians, and it's like, yeah, but they're not from Gaul or Thrace. They are being trained to fight as Gauls and Thracians in the gladiatorial combats. But they're, we get even in the sources, you get they're Germans, they're Gauls. You're like, well, hang on, where are the Germans? Because are they Gauls or Thracians? And there's that confusion. And to this day, people will say that Spartacus was from Thrace. And you're like, that's not what the sources tell you. You've just made that up based on the fact that he's being trained as a Gaul or a Thracian in Capua. So that is exactly what you're talking about, that we're being told this thing, and that then becomes that's that. You're like, no, that's they've misunderstood their own.
With the Spartacus thing, in terms of the Spartacus name, again, is supposedly associated with that region, but that sort of assumes that everybody with that name has to be linked to that region as such. There's no
also stylistic pressure for gladiators to fight in particular modes, and there's a layer of theater over gladiator personas, which pollutes the narrative. I think, is it Barry Strauss who wrote the Spartacus War? Yeah, he I'm pretty sure, am I wrong about this? He hits this very thing, right, at length in the first couple of chapters of that book, which is super helpful, just for listeners if folks want to expand.
So the question, let's go back. So the question was what Romans were more afraid of organized enemies? Okay. Wow.
Let me put forward Carthaginians, because the Carthaginians organized enemy. There wasn't a land border, but wasn't it Cato who allegedly told the story, held up the fresh fig. It said this came from Carthage to show how close they were by sea, and they fought the Romans for decades on end in several wars. Hannibal was in the south of Italy for all those years after Cannae and held on. Now there's a lot there, but it's Carthage was one of those enemies where the Romans, I think, feared them so much that they destroyed them utterly after the Third War. So certainly Carthage was a neighboring enemy, let's say, that the Romans were of whom the Romans were very fearful.
So I like that. So I was going to work that this transition between these people that are on your border and then they become an enemy. I mean, my impression is for a lot of Roman history, they just kind of get along with people. I mean, the borders are very vague ideas. It may be a river, it may be a forest or a ravine or something, and there's no hard frontier for most of the time. And then something happens, like with Carthage, right? There's that one of their allies gets hit, and then they appeal to Rome and said, "Help!" And then Rome treaty bound to get involved, but they weren't really enemies, as I understand it before that point.
I like your very Roman interpretation that there aren't hard borders. We'll change it when we look like we want to change it. You're like, well, that river that takes a lot of crossing, that's the border. Oh, not now, it's not. We're changing it to another river further north. And I think the reality is that there are hard borders, but the Roman mindset is no, they're not.
The Roman mindset is, the world is ours, except some people don't realize it yet.
To this day, you'll come across properties. Oh, you see that tree there? To the left of that, there's a stone. That's the boundary. That's
right, but give you an example. So Pomponius Mela, right? A book which is called the Crollo, something or other. It's now called Description of the World, because I can't even pronounce that Latin word. He will describe Germania in terms of rivers and mountains, right? But what's interesting is if you then look at someone like Julius Caesar, I'm not sure you get those kind of definitions, because their spatial understanding of the world is an evolving one, right? So they will, there is a thing called...
I would say it's a spatially evolving one because they look to conquer it. If you talk to someone about where is the border between your land and their land, they will give you a very exact, that tree, that stream, that's the border. And in Greece, they would fight over that land and who controls it yearly. But the reality is that they knew the boundary of their territory. And I think the tribal territories knew exactly the boundary between the two. Even if it's disputed, even if you fight over it every year, Rome comes in and goes, we ignore your boundaries because they're our boundaries and we are boundaryless. So I think it's a mindset thing. The reality, even for the Romans crossing the English Channel, no one's done that before. But when Caesar did it, it was like, right, now we can do that.
The Carthaginians were in Sicily for centuries, and the Romans didn't have difficulty with the Carthaginians being there until the Romans had brought southern Italy under their sway. And then suddenly anything that might go wrong in Sicily was their problem, because their dominion over south of Italy was so threatened by it. I mean, it was really what happened very close by with the Mamertines that brought about the First War. It did not involve an immediate, direct Roman Carthaginian clash, but the Romans had to get involved because the Carthaginians were getting involved, and both of them went into a multi-decade war because of that. So I do agree that where the Romans, for instance, considered their border, what their interests evolved. So various places, the more that they pushed their boundaries forward, the more they found that they had potential enemies, and that's probably where Rome, came into conflict with other people. Whether it was an organized state, or they may have come into contact with, so-called barbarian enemies. It all depends.
Isn't the question also of, the question is, do Romans feel more threatened? I mean, how are we going to interpret that? Is that, who are they more afraid of? Or is it, as you just said, is it what is the reason essentially for saying, we feel threatened and therefore we need to attack, but it's just a flexible interpretation of how just wars are declared, and therefore you have to make up some kind of excuse. What are we telling the future generations about why this war began? I mean, this is a very layered, problematic question.
I think we're missing an opportunity to. So Mark DeSantis has brought up Carthage, and what I was talking about with Lindsay before we started recording was the Senones in 390, which I think Mark McCaffrey mentioned. And the thing that those two experiences have in common for Rome is the perception of an existential threat, whether or not it's true. Now, in the case of the Senones in 390, it certainly was true. Rome got sacked. In the case of the Carthaginians, maybe not in hindsight, right? Hannibal kind of got stuck, in my opinion, in the peninsula. He couldn't have marched on Rome. A lot of ink has been spilled on that, mostly by Theodore Dodge. But the perception culturally was, oh my God, this could be the end. And it was an experience that I don't think Rome had experienced encountering any other enemy, not the Samnites, not in Magna Graecia and fighting Pyrrhus even, up to that time. And that perception, I think, created a cultural trauma, which I've theorized resulted in cribbing Gallic kit, which was the birth of the Polybian Legion out of the hoplite phalanx. And I want to be clear, this is disputed. What's one of the things that Lindsay and Jasper brought up? There's argument over that. But the point is that when you see it that way, and that is your barometer for what does Rome perceive as an existential threat. This also extends to the Goths and the Huns, right? You have where you're getting emperors killed, and you're getting Adrianople. Like, that's some serious stuff. And what's so interesting about that to me is that sense of cultural trauma gets conveyed into pop culture and into the modern day in the same way that the myth of Spartan supremacy does. This idea of hordes of barbarians banging at the gates, which is such a powerful symbol. It's used in modern politics, right, all the time. And that really is conveyed, I think, from that sense of Roman cultural trauma. So unfortunately, it doesn't answer the question of the writer, because Carthage is most certainly an organized nation state. And the Gauls, at least as it's conveyed to us by these very, bigoted, not giving them a fair treatment Greco-Roman writers, is that they're disorganized tribes. Who knows the truth of either?
So go back to Mark DeSantis. I think the example of Carthage is very interesting, because in a sense it starts with a treaty and a diplomatic spat, which then leads to outright war, which they then negotiate as a diplomatic treaty, which is to see the Spartans have to give their fleet and so many talents of gold and whatever. And as long as they hold to that treaty, we kind of let them be Carthaginians. And the trouble is they don't seem to be able to hold to that. So they
Until
keep
we
going back
don't,
and
then we'll attack you because you crossed a river we never mentioned. Then we'll attack you again. How dare you?
Right, but the point is, I mean, that they presumably, in the Roman mindset here, look at it from the point of, we have a treaty with these people, right? So as long as we all keep to the letter of the law or the treaty terms, we're okay with that. We don't necessarily perceive them as enemies. What we perceive them as enemies is that when they break this, and then we go along to the Temple of Bellona and stick a spear in the ground and say, we're at war, folks, having gone to the Fetiales and said, by the way, we remind you there's a treaty 3 times. And so,
mind you, again, I'll bring up the Huns. We've got a treaty with you. We're not going to meet the terms of those treaty. We're not going to pay you what we said we would pay you. Why are you attacking us? Oh, you're bad treaty-breaking Huns. No. We're attacking you because you promised to pay us to not attack you. You didn't pay us. We're attacking you.
Hold on. There's two sides in terms of treaties. The Romans stick to treaties sometimes and their enemies break them. But on the other hand, their enemies sometimes try to stick to a treaty. Like I'm thinking of Jugurtha here in terms of the Romans saying, here, we've got a treaty. You seem to be bending some rules, but actually we don't mind because actually we've got other things on our plate. Therefore, we're not really interested. Hold on. We need to have an inquiry into that. We'll take a little bit of bribery on the side. Oh, hold on. The bribery might be a bit of a problem. Our system might be in question under this. Now we'll look into it more seriously. Now we're sort of interested in it, but we've still got a bit of a problem on the northern borders. We'll come back to you. Oh, yes, actually, now we're interested. It's the Roman politics of when it suits them, and I think I think we're going to have trouble actually saying, is it a nation state or otherwise that Rome really fears? Because I think a lot of the time it comes down to, is it convenient for Rome? What is convenient for Rome? And you can go into Caesar as well and say Caesar is going to hold those Germanic hordes across the Rhine. He's not going to let them into Gaul. They are going to terrorize Gaul, and that's going to knock on into the province. But hold on, if the Gauls rebel, who do you call on? That's right. We'll bring in the Germanic cavalry and now sort out all of our problems in Gaul.
Mark, is this unique to Rome, though? This kind of double dealing?
It's just we don't have as much information about it from other people.
Well, but this is sort of the language of empire, right?
But the way that the Romans actually described, if I remember from the book I wrote, was the fact is that they distrusted the Carthaginians and they were pejorative about them because they could not be trusted to keep to the treaty terms. So they were ultimately despised because in this world order that we've created of treaties and borders and such like, and as long as everybody plays nice, we'll keep trading and stuff, but those people keep breaking their damn treaties. And therefore, we ultimately, to solve the problem, will take it on. The impression I have, for example, Italy itself wasn't even completely conquered until something like 15 BC, right? I think beyond the Pope was still part of Rhaetia, effectively. What got the Romans finally to declare war is the constant raiding and ambushing of Roman trading parties. And they just had enough of it. So in that case, they just dealt with the situation. So they opted for a war solution to that problem. And then the following war, the Alpine War and the German wars under Drusus, were wars of choice, not ones of necessity, but they were prompted, as it turns out, by either Germanic invasions over which Marcus Aurelius had to deal with, or these ones I've referred to as Rhaetian. So it goes back to Mark's point in a sense. It depends on an awful lot of things. The expediency of now and what other things we're distracted by. It was convenient for Augustus to do those things because his political position was, I've got this deal with the Senate, which gives me power as long as I'm actually pacifying all these dangerous states around the world. And it pays to keep some of those not pacified or keep wars going because then they'll renew my powers at the end of it. But that wasn't always the case. And in the case of Caesar, I mean, in fact, they wanted to haul him back to Italy and put him on trial because he broke the terms of his proconsular activities.
Or hand him over to the Gauls, possibly, if Cato had his way.
I want to put a word in for the Vandals who haven't made a mention yet. And I think in terms of Mike's idea of trauma, the funny thing about the Vandals is, of course, they invade Gaul, march through Gaul. And that you have the combined king of the Vandals and the Alans, who then march through Spain, apparently entering Spain on a Tuesday, which is why to this day, to our Spanish listeners, it's Black Tuesday, because it was a Tuesday in 406 AD. And then, of course, they conquer North Africa in a lightning campaign. And Rome pretty much forgets that they're there until the Vandals are then turning the Eastern Mediterranean into a Vandal Sea. They conquer Sardinia. They raid Italy endlessly. They sack Rome. They take empresses and princesses prisoner and hostage. But there's this sort of...
Well, they also cut off the most lucrative trade and foodstuff source. I think that's another major factor.
But I think the threat that the Vandals pose, and the fact that we still use the word Vandal for what supposedly the Vandals did, this lawless destruction, when the reality of Vandal North Africa is very civilized and pretty much continuity with what came before, just who was in charge got changed. And so, and there's several attempts to reconquer North Africa, and they are complete failures until Belisarius. So the interesting thing with all of that is that the Romans forget about that. It's like they have an arm chopped off with North Africa and the grain supply, and they kind of go, nothing we can do about that. Let's move on. And then the Vandals turn up on the Roman coast and they sack Rome. It's only a flesh wound, and then they sack Rome in 455, and and it's kind of like, that was bad, but it's this sort of like we're powerless to stop it. So in many ways, Alaric in 410 and the Vandals in 455 are the first enemies to sack Rome, other than Romans, since 390 BC. And so that's probably. But did the Vandals want to conquer Italy? No, they just wanted to sack Rome.
I just looked up Augustine of Hippo. He missed it. He missed it by a few years.
The sack of Rome by Alaric is well known. We've talked about. St. Augustine dealt with it. But is there, when you consider when the 455 sack of Rome by the Vandals took place, obviously Vandal then became a byword for wanton destruction. But was there anyone following him, following that event, such as a St. Augustine, who could have dealt with that in some sort of historical, theological treatise that would have maybe seared it on people's minds beyond what it was. And I don't think there was.
There wasn't. It's just chroniclers. It's all the ones who were. It's a year and a line. It makes me crazy. Like Marcellinus Comus. I don't know if you've read him. Like it's they give you just enough. Like I dealt with this in the Killing Ground all the time. Is that we had to write whole chapters based on a single line because we're trying to be comprehensive about every battle. That Age of the Chroniclers is just a nightmare.
Yeah. But the weirdest one is where you get a different chronicle. So you get Hydatius or someone, or the Chronicon Pascale, and you're like, hang on, why does yours say something different? Oh, wait, why are you saying that? That none of the others say that. What? And then you can extrapolate that into a huge, thing.
A Netflix documentary series. We'll all be rich.
So it's a tricky one, but I think it's also one of those things about these enemies is that some of them are flavors that they are threats. They are not threats. Some you can't mention. We don't mention civil wars. Cleopatra is the threat. Cleopatra is not a threat. Antony's the threat. Talk about Antony. No. We talk about the Mad Queen, and and it's clear in that propaganda we're talking about Antony, and the fact that he's allied to Cleopatra means we're talking about Cleopatra. So, and you get that sort of idea. And later you get this really interesting lionization of some of these, especially Sertorius gets a whole bunch of attention paid to him as a great commander, even though it's sort of like, hang on a minute, he's not really, oh, okay, yeah, no, he's one of the generals who's used as an exemplar of good command.
Or you get the Roman author wanting to do the Tacitus or the Sallust take of, I can criticize Rome by putting it in the mouth of my main barbarian counterpart. So, of course, Jugurtha coming in and saying, right, this city is for sale. Who will be the highest bidder? Highlighting the corruption of Rome. It's a way of actually, how can I say, self-defecating on the entire city without getting in trouble about it.
There's also an attempt, Mark, to how do I say this to, and I'm speaking more of Jordanes here, to like Romanize an ethnic population that is moving into the halls of power, right? Let me explain to you why the Goths are entitled to where they are in the emperor's good graces in the court. Let me show you their great and glorious legacy and why they're worthy of. You got to remember that the people fighting Alaric for the most part, a lot of other Goths that are in Roman kit and doing that. Just as I think it was you who pointed out the German horse guard, being such a critical part of not only specialty military units but like units that are charged with protecting the emperor himself. So there is, like, it's funny, we talk about Rome's enemies, but we're also really talking about the next generation of political power in Rome.
It's only Rome that can, within a generation, go from barbarian to one of us as such.
Which by the way, is such, and I'm not the first person to say this, like when you look at the survivability and the impact that Rome has on global civilization, that what we're describing, that ability to be flexible, adaptable, to do what Alexander failed to do when he tried to sort of cosmopolize Hellenistic and Persian culture. You will marry these women. That did not work out. But Rome figured it out. The Romans figured it out.
Rome figures it out and then doesn't figure it out, because that whole like, oh, now you're one of us until you're not. Stilicho, oh, amazing, brilliant. No, now you're a barbarian traitor. We're going to put you to death. So, and there's various, Arados.
It worked pretty well for a while.
It did work. It did until it didn't. So yeah, but I think the fascinating thing with all of those is that it's Rome deciding the rules and changing the rules when it suits Rome, and that's a millennia long attitude that Rome has, that everything is fine until we decide it's not.
I will tell you this, Murray, we in the United States of America have never done anything like that.
No, I know, but the funny thing about the United States, and Britain too, the British Empire, but again, looking at both of those, they're juniors in comparison to the Roman Empire in terms of the longevity of the Roman Empire and how long it took the Roman Empire to fall. Even the British Empire is a lightweight. the British Empire was gone in half a millennium. Rome's guffawing at the short-lasting nature of the British Empire.
We really think that you would enjoy this opium and should let it into your country.
Yes, tea. What we want to do? How can we steal tea out of China, and where else can we grow it? Let's grow it there. No, it doesn't work. Let's grow it there. Oh, nice. India and Ceylon. Brilliant. So
before we get even more distracted, this is kind of what we've given a more sort of political military response to the question about what does Rome feel more threatened by, and I'm not sure Brian is satisfied by the answer. Can we give a cultural response? Which enemy leaves the biggest scar on the Roman psyche? I mean, maybe it's a gimme, but
no, I don't know. You say that, I say Greek. If you want to abuse a Roman at various points in time in Roman history, you accuse them of being a Philhellene.
Well, no, but hold on a second. Philhellenism, at least in the Polybian, the period of the Polybian Republic, that's the lingua franca, man. That's what you want. You're going to a you speak Greek
until it's not, and then you're a soft Greek. The second sophistic Greek is everywhere until it's not, and you're a soft Greek. So I think and Rome has a real problem with Greek influence. It's everywhere. It's everything they do, but they then have to try and claim it as their own. And if it's too Greek, it's a bad thing. But if it's not Greek enough, it's not a good thing.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I
don't think that was what Jasper was going for. But anyway,
of course, I will vote for the Gauls just because of that cultural trauma, the early cultural trauma, rather, in 390 of Rome almost going out before the candle really had a chance to burn. Mark's point about Carthage, I think, is extremely well taken, but Rome got a hold of Carthage. They really did. And not only, one can argue in that brief period of Hannibal's presence on the peninsula, it seems, it doesn't seem like as serious an issue. But I do think that really stuck in Roman memory. And there are so many things, examples I brought up before, the use of the Montefortino helmet, that is a Celtic design. The use of, and I had said this before, so forgive me for repeating myself, but I said when we were recording, what Pausanias describes as the national shield, which of course he's describing as sort of that like Thoreau style, central spine, central boss shield, which, if you accept my hypothesis that the Romans defeated at the Allia in 390 were fighting as hoplites, is a departure from the Argive crypt. And you look at the reinforcements that we found, these strips of metal across the top. Why are you doing that? You don't need to do that for a spear. You need to do it for a sword. They're thinking about Celts. They really are. And I think that's pretty obvious both in defensive measures and in the evolution of how they fight. And just thinking of it from a military perspective, what do you do when you get your butt handed to you, right? You try to figure out how to stop that from happening. You're going to look at the person who did it. And that was
the commanders to death. That's what you do.
It's in the language as well. I mean, in terms of what you're saying about the Gauls and the Western enemies that Rome's coming up against, all you have to look at is the fact that, it does come through a lot in Caesar's writing, but the idea of oppidum being the go-to language of anything that's out there, despite what its size might be. It might be when he arrives in Britannia and they attack something which seems to be just off the coast of the Channel, and yet there's nothing there. They've attacked an oppidum. On the other hand, they can attack something on the edge of the Black Forest, and it's an oppidum, and it's got 50,000 people in it. But on the other hand, you've got herbs as being used for anything in Italy, despite its size. Pompeii is an herbs, because it is their culture, or it's theirs as such.
Right, so, and they can be very parochial, and they can be very snobbish. And it's very much in them and us. I mean, we're civilized and these people are not. I mean, so herbs is the essence of civilized living, right? And an oppidum presumably is not. It's a mud hut in a ditch.
Yeah. Well, you can see that in the cities trying to get colonia as their title. They can be as city-like as another city, but they're not a colonia yet. So there's that. I was coming back to optics and reminded very much of Boys of Company C. See that division over there on that hill? What division? That division of the enemy. Oh, yeah, I see them. Let's blow them up and tell everybody we just killed 2,000 of the enemy. And I think some of these expeditions are very similar to that you're like, yeah, I invaded and I took all this spoil. What spoil? That looks like a piece of furniture out of the palace that I saw there last week. No, that's Dacian. That's Dacian spoil. So, it seems to be one of the lessons that Domitian learns. Well, sorry, Domitian doesn't learn it. Trajan learns it from Domitian, that you need to tell us what you've been doing in the Dacian war, because there's nothing coming back to Rome that we're particularly happy with. There's no spoil, there's no conquest, there's no slaves really, although we do get big numbers earlier on and transferring them in Moesia, but not back to Rome. So the idea that you just made up an oppidum attack, you attacked an oppidum, did you? It was a hut. It was a single hut with a single family. Oh no, it was an oppidum. It was an entire tribe that and I think that optics thing is one of the reasons for Trajan's column is propaganda to advertise this is what I was doing. And it's one of the things Domitian does not do. And he gets abused for having sham triumphs and sham spoils. And so Trajan kind of goes, all right, well, I won't do what you did. I'll learn your lesson.
And in the same way, Murray, the Roman fascination with collecting things. So you talk about spoils, but if you look at La Tourbie with that great inscription, which I think Pliny the Elder preserved, it's like 50, 60 tribes. We conquered the Alps. And in case you don't know, we'll list the people. And it's this way of organizing the world by giving them names. And if we don't know what the names are, we'll just invent one like Germani. Right. And it turns out many of the Germani that Caesar probably encountered weren't actually what we think as Germanic. They were actually Gallic or Celtic. And what's fascinating, because I'm actually working on a book about Roman conquest Germany, which in a sense is a contradiction in terms, because there were really no conquests of Germany. The point is there that as I think one of the speakers earlier was talking about, as they push the borders, they become more exposed to more people. And in this Roman sort of cataloging of the world, I mean, it's overwhelming when you look at some of these reconstructed maps of what the lands beyond the Danube and the Rhine look like. I mean, they just overlaid names. And it's anybody's guess as to whether they're geographically correct, because people are trying to make sense of them.
It's also interesting, we talk about the Swabian knot as being an indicator of the Swabi. And one of the anecdotes in Marcus Aurelius's war is that there are Quadi and Marcomanni who look like Swabi, and they're trying to pass as one of the other tribes in Rome, and the Romans cannot tell the difference between them.
I think I read that in a.
Yeah, they do. So yes, there you go.
Can we just say, Murray, that the presence of a Swabian knot indicates that you live in Brooklyn, work for a tech startup, and drink craft beer?
Yeah. The man bun as ancient cultural indicator. Shift that to the side. I think we should start a trend that the man bun has to actually shift.
I'm sorry, Murray, you're going to have to do it. I don't think anybody else is going to be able to join you anytime soon.
Yeah, not me. But I think that the point is an interesting one about the organizing of the world and defining who's an enemy and whether it's an organized state, like, for example, the Parthians, who just seem to be this great big 800-pound gorilla on the other side of the world, and they keep poking it. I don't quite know why they want to do that, but it's optics and politics that we want to appear to be the stronger one. And barbarians are kind of soft touches because they're so disorganized. They're not civilized. So to deal with and be faced with an enemy that is an organized state, that's probably more terrifying. So I'm going to give that's my take on the final.
Right. I think the Parthians are the Parthians are fascinating because the number of crises with the Parthians. So there's Trajan's Parthian War, but then there's a crisis in 123 that Hadrian deals with. There's a crisis in Antoninus Pius's reign that we know nothing about, other than he stopped it by writing a letter. That's all we're told. And then there's the Varus's Parthian War in the 160s. All of those are only two Parthian kings. Vologeses III is king from 110 to 147, and then Vologeses IV is king from 147 to 193. So hang on, you're fighting the same king multiple times, and the same happens with is it Crucio II? Is that the right king in the 4th century? He's king from 309 AD to 373 AD.
We've talked about Armenia in a previous podcast, and I think what's very interesting is that Armenia becomes this sort of place where Romans fight Parthians and Medes and so on, without actually fighting Parthians and Medes, because
they both invade and meet in the middle, basically.
Yes, because I think they understand the calculus is terrifyingly bad if they actually go to war with the opponent. But they can scrap over this little place called Armenia. In fact, I just finished my book on Tiberius, and there was a war of choice. People think that Tiberius didn't actually go to war with anybody, but he did. And Vitellius was sent out there to deal with it. But effectively, it was also a very clever way of manipulating some of the alliances within Armenia and Parthia. Right. I mean, there were politics within the Parthian Empire, which were trying to actually maneuver against the King of Kings or be on side. And the Romans were very adept at, manipulating.
Well, that's both what Lucullus and Pompey do when they're fighting the Parthians in the first century BC.
And now nobody has mentioned the poor Celto-Iberians that the Romans spent nearly 2 centuries fighting.
They're Celts.
Threatened by
Celts.
Yeah. Oh, that's now we're going to get hate mail from Spain.
Yeah. But I actually, look, it's a and I don't, I focus so much on military history, but one of the things, if you're looking for cultural scars and you're looking for who people fear, I think that often in the ancient medieval world, you see it's always threats to women. It's always that they're kidnapping women, they're abusing. When you see that cultural animosity, they're coming for our wives and daughters. That is an indicator, usually, I think, of where cultures are. But I'm not. Yeah, I'm not from. Well, not just piracy. Threats to the purity and the integrity of our women. That is,
and yet that's exactly what the Romans do.
Oh, absolutely. But it's a surefire indicator. But I'm not familiar with any source material that points to that in particular.
Caesar, in terms of saying we don't spare anyone, the men were so fed up with Avaricum, sorry, and after the siege there, that they were so fed up, and he gave over the city to plunder, and no one was spared, the women or the children, etc. So, and it was 40,000 population, 800 escaped.
But see, within Roman definitions, that's success, And it's because, again, and I always like going back to the coinage. The coinage has what we think of being obscene kinds of images of captured, tied up captives, or, for example, a Roman boot on the Jew's neck, and these sorts of things. I mean, these were the propaganda images of strength projecting.
Well, that's the
superiority.
Very first image of Britannia, isn't it?
Yes.
Is under the Roman foot, being held down. So,
and a snake, weirdly.
Well, this is a bombshell to end on, but I think we can probably keep going for a while. But I don't know. I think we tried to give a response to Brian. I hope
we've tried to answer one question.
Well, we said at the start it was a very big topic, and we could probably spin it out to a few more episodes. But for now, we'll call it quits, and I'll see you again very soon. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.